Miss Marple and the last entry in the diary. Chapter 1. A quiet afternoon in Rosehill. The village of Rosehill lay in the golden hush of late summer, its cobbled lanes warmed by the lingering sun, its gardens bright with dahlias and hollyhocks. It was the kind of afternoon when nothing dreadful seemed possible, when the air itself carried a sort of tranquil promise. Housewives leaned over gates to exchange gossip, the milk cart rattled cheerfully down the high street, and the sound of church bells drifted lazily from St. Michael's Tower. Miss Jane Marple, settled comfortably in her garden chair behind the white picket fence of her cottage, might have seemed the very picture of retirement. Her knitting needles clicked softly as she shaped the beginnings of a baby's cardigan, a gift for the grocer's niece, soon to be married and already anticipating motherhood. Yet Miss Marple's pale blue eyes, bright and unyielding even at her considerable age, saw far more than the yarn in her lap. From her shaded seat, she observed life in Rosehill as though it were a play performed upon a stage. Mr. Godfrey Trent, the village solicitor, passed by with unusual haste, his brow damp, his briefcase clutched too tightly. Mrs. Edith Bell, a widow known for her tireless curiosity, lingered overlong at the baker's stall, her gaze fixed on more than just currant buns. Even young Peter Ellison, the vicar's son, darted along the lane with a guilty look, as though he carried some unspoken mischief. Miss Marple smiled faintly to herself. Villages, after all, were much the same wherever one went, little hives of human nature, with secrets buzzing beneath the surface. And if one lived long enough, one learned to recognize the hum. That evening, Rosehill's sense of calm was broken. The disturbance came during the harvest fair, the yearly occasion that drew everyone, from the wealthiest landowner to the humblest gardener, onto the green with stalls of jam, pickles, and competitions for best dahlias. Lanterns strung between the trees began to glow as dusk fell, and the village band, slightly out of tune but enthusiastically proud, struck up a waltz. Laughter and music filled the air. It was then that the first scream rang out. The sound silenced the crowd, cutting across the strains of the band. Heads turned, murmurs rose, and in the space of a heartbeat the joyful atmosphere changed into something sharp and uneasy. The scream had come from the old rectory, just beyond the churchyard, its tall windows looming pale in the twilight. A cluster of villagers rushed forward, Mr. Trent among them, his face drawn and pale now. Soon after, the policeman stationed in Rosehill, Sergeant Webb, appeared, his whistle shrill as he cleared a path through the gathering crowd. Miss Marple, who had risen with surprising swiftness for her age, followed at a measured pace, unnoticed amid the rush. Inside the rectory, the scene was grim. At the desk in the late Reverend Harcourt's study, a heavy oak piece, crowded with papers and ink bottles, sat a young woman in her mid-twenties, head slumped forward, golden hair falling across her cheek. Her hand still clutched a fountain pen. Beside her, open on the blotter, lay a leather-bound diary. But the last entry had been violently interrupted, the ink running in a jagged smear across the page. The girl, known to the villagers as Clara Goddard, daughter of the late Colonel Goddard, was quite unmistakably dead. Gasps filled the room. Mrs. Bell whispered something about poison. Mr. Trent muttered about the shock. The policeman barked for order. And through it all, Miss Marple stood quietly near the doorway, her knitting bag still looped over her arm, her expression grave yet composed. Her eyes rested not only on the girl, but on the diary, and then on the faces of those gathered around. She noted the quick glance exchanged between Mr. Trent and Mrs. Bell, the way Sergeant Webb's eyes avoided the desk, and the strange, nervous stillness in young Peter Ellison, who hovered in the corner like a child caught out in some wrongdoing. Miss Marple knew well enough that murder seldom appeared suddenly, like a storm. More often, it brewed quietly, in whispered resentments and hidden betrayals, until it broke upon the world in an instant of violence. And in Rosehill, on this quiet summer evening, it had broken indeed. Chapter 2. Whispers in the Rectory. The study at the old rectory had taken on an oppressive stillness, broken only by the rustle of skirts and the low murmur of shocked voices. Sergeant Webb, flustered but determined, pushed the villagers back a step, his mustache bristling with authority. "Now then, all of you must wait outside," he declared. "This is police business. Miss Goddard's condition must be seen to properly." No one moved at first. The sight of Clara Goddard, Her lifeless figure still poised at the desk with the diary open before her, seemed to root them where they stood. Mrs. Bell clutched at her shawl, whispering, "So young, such a dreadful end," while Mr. Trent dabbed at his forehead with a handkerchief, his eyes fixed not on the poor girl but on the desk, where the diary's ink blots spread like a stain of accusation. Miss Marple, standing quietly near the back, observed in silence. She knew, as few others did, that people revealed much in moments of shock, little gestures, hasty glances, things spoken too quickly. Already, she had noticed more than she cared to admit. At length, the crowd began to drift reluctantly into the hall, leaving only Sergeant Webb, Mr. Trent, who insisted upon remaining as Clara's family solicitor, and the vicar, Reverend Ellison. The vicar looked pale and troubled, his hands twisting together in distress. It is beyond belief," he murmured. "Clara was assisting me only this week with the harvest accounts. She was so lively, so full of plans." His voice broke. Mr. Trent cleared his throat. "Yes, indeed. A terrible tragedy. But, perhaps it is not a matter for excitement. A sudden heart failure, perhaps? The poor girl was highly strung." Sergeant Webb shot him a doubtful glance. "Heart failure, is it? Then why the diary, Why the smudged entry?" The diary remained upon the desk, its pages fluttering slightly in the draught from the open window. Miss Marple, her gaze as calm as ever, noted the words half-written before the ink trailed away. "I must tell the truth at last. Tonight." Her eyes rested there a moment longer, before shifting to the pen in Clara's hand. It was uncapped, the nib dark with wet ink. On the blotter lay a curious smear, not the line of a faltering hand, but a jagged mark as though the page had been brushed roughly. "Best cover it," muttered Sergeant Webb, snapping the diary shut. "It'll go with the doctor's report." The vicar made the sign of the cross and stepped back. But Miss Marple, before the book was taken away, had already committed the page to memory. Words half-written often spoke louder than words completed. Outside, the villagers pressed close, hungry for news. Gossip bloomed like ivy, curling and creeping in every direction. Some said Clara had poisoned herself. She had been unhappy, they whispered, since her father's death left her with little fortune. Others hinted at a romance gone sour, though no one could agree upon the supposed gentleman. By the time Miss Marple returned to her cottage, the story had grown yet further. Mrs. Bell was already telling anyone who would listen that Clara had been writing a confession of sorts. Something dreadful about the Colonel's will. Another villager swore he had seen Clara in tears only yesterday, speaking in hushed tones with Mr. Trent outside his office. Miss Marple set down her knitting bag and lit her lamp, her expression thoughtful. Villages were much like books, she mused. Every page must be turned, every margin studied, if one wished to understand the whole. And this story, it seemed, had only just begun. She drew her chair closer to the fire, her mind turning over the faces she had seen at the rectory. Mr. Trent, nervous and damp with sweat. Mrs. Bell, eager to share her theories. The vicar, pale with unease. And young Peter Ellison, lingering too long in the corner with eyes that darted like a guilty schoolboy's. Clara Goddard had died suddenly, yes. But the diary told its own tale. A last entry, broken mid-sentence, as though the truth itself had been silenced. And Miss Marple, her needles clicking once more in the quiet cottage, knew she would not rest until she discovered why. Chapter 3. The Village Speculates. By the following morning, Rosehill was abuzz. The tragedy at the rectory had spread through the lanes and cottages faster than wildfire. Housewives paused in their washing, tradesmen delayed their deliveries, and even the postmistress could scarcely concentrate on her letters for all the whispered inquiries that passed through her counter. "Poison," declared Mrs. Bell to anyone who would listen. "I heard the doctor say so myself, and if you ask me, it was slipped into her tea. At the butcher's, Mr. Samuel Pritchard had his own view." "Nonsense. She was writing something dangerous in that diary, that's what I heard. Someone stopped her before she finished it." He wagged a sausage-stained finger. "Mark my words, it'll be murder." Others were less certain. Some clung to the idea of a sudden illness, or even self-harm. But none could deny the strange detail of the unfinished words in Clara's diary. The phrase, "I must tell the truth at last," had already become the subject of endless speculation. What truth? About whom? Miss Marple, meanwhile, went about her morning as usual. She watered her roses, collected her post, and greeted the baker with a gentle word of thanks for her daily loaf. Yet wherever she went, she was drawn into little snatches of gossip. Each account differed slightly from the last, and each held its own curious shade of meaning. By noon, she had gathered enough to know that Clara Goddard's life had not been so simple as it appeared. There were whispers of disagreements with her cousin over the Colonel's estate. There was talk of a quarrel with Mr. Trent, the solicitor. And there was a persistent murmur of some private distress, a broken promise, perhaps, or a romance that had ended badly. At the rectory itself, Sergeant Webb stood guard, his broad frame planted firmly at the door. "No one's to enter," he told the villagers sternly. "This is official business. The doctor will make his report soon enough." But sternness did little to quench curiosity. Already, Mrs. Bell was recounting, with impressive embroidery, how she had seen Clara speaking secretly with young Peter Ellison 2 nights before her death. Miss Marple listened politely, her expression mild. She knew too well that gossip often held a kernel of truth, though one must sift it carefully from layers of fancy. Later that day, she received an unexpected visitor. Reverend Ellison himself called at her cottage, looking weary and distraught. "Miss Marple," he said earnestly, "you were at the rectory last night. You saw Clara. You have such wisdom in these matters. Tell me, do you think, was it really murder?" Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap and regarded him with kind, steady eyes. "It is not for me to say just yet, Reverend. But one thing I do know, when a young woman begins to write the truth and is stopped before she can finish it, it is seldom chance that silences her." The vicar paled. "Then someone in this village?" Miss Marple gave the faintest of smiles. "Villages, my dear Reverend, are made up of people. And people, alas, are capable of all sorts of things." The clock on her mantel struck 4. Outside, the sound of children playing in the lane carried in through the open window, a reminder that life on the surface went on. Yet beneath the calm, Miss Marple could already feel the darker current stirring. Somewhere in Rosehill, someone knew the meaning of that broken diary entry. Someone had silenced Clara Goddard. And Miss Marple, with her quiet persistence, intended to find out who. Chapter 4. The Obvious Suspect. The inquest into Clara Goddard's death was set for the following week, but already Sergeant Webb believed he had a lead. His confidence was plain the next morning when he strode through the high street, his boots striking the cobblestones with unusual force, as if the very sound might assure the villagers that justice was in hand. That afternoon, word spread that young Peter Ellison, the vicar's son, had been questioned at length. By evening, the story had grown to the point that some villagers swore he had been arrested outright. Mrs. Bell, of course, was the first to repeat it. "Well, I knew it the moment I saw him," she told her small gathering at the tea shop. "Shifty eyes, and always running about at odd hours. What business had he at the rectory 2 nights ago? Mark my words, the police have their man." Miss Marple, seated quietly with her tea and a scone, listened without comment. She remembered very well how Peter had lingered in the corner of the rectory study on the night of the tragedy, pale and restless, but she also recalled the trembling in his hands, not of a murderer, but of a frightened boy who had seen more than he wished. Later that evening, the vicar himself called again at Miss Marple's cottage. His face was drawn, his eyes shadowed. "Miss Marple," he said gravely, "the sergeant is convinced that Peter had something to do with Clara's death. It is," his voice caught, "it is unthinkable. My boy may be foolish, but he is not wicked." Miss Marple poured him a cup of tea with steady hands. "Calm yourself, Reverend. The police must follow their course, and it is often the most obvious path that seems easiest to them. But I do not think, for my part, that your son is guilty of this crime." The vicar's relief was evident, yet his brow remained troubled. But why was Peter seen near the rectory? What business had he there, if not some clandestine purpose? Miss Marple gave him a gentle smile. "There are many reasons why a young man might seek out a young woman in private, some innocent, some less so. But murder, Reverend? Murder requires something more than youthful indiscretion. It requires calculation or desperation. That night, as she sat by her fire with her knitting, Miss Marple reflected upon the diary once more. I must tell the truth at last. Tonight. The words echoed in her mind. A confession, yes, but a confession to whom? And of what? The truth Clara had meant to reveal must have been dangerous indeed, for it had brought about her death before she could write it down. And yet, if the sergeant was so certain of Peter Ellison, why was she herself so unconvinced? Because, Miss Marple thought, setting down her needles, Peter had neither the experience nor the cunning for such a deed. His guilt was too obvious, too easily plucked from the whispers of the village. And in her long experience, the obvious suspect was very seldom the true one. Chapter 5. Shadows of the Past. Rosehill was not a place where secrets stayed buried for long. By the third day after Clara Goddard's death, old tales began to stir again. Stories of the colonel's temper, of quarrels over land, of money that seemed to vanish as swiftly as it was earned. Miss Marple, walking slowly down the lane with her shopping basket, heard fragments of it all. At the greengrocer's, Mrs. Bell spoke in hushed but eager tones of the colonel's will, which was not as straightforward as people think. At the post office, Mr. Pritchard leaned across the counter to whisper about debts Clara's late father had left unsettled. Even the milkman, usually the least curious of men, muttered something about a quarrel between Clara and her cousin George over the inheritance. In the village, whispers were currency, and everyone spent freely. That afternoon, Miss Marple paid a quiet call upon Mrs. Harcourt, the widow of the late rector. The elderly woman lived now in a smaller cottage, her health frail but her memory still keen. She had always been fond of Clara, who often visited her with baskets of fruit and flowers. She was a sweet girl, though troubled, Mrs. Harcourt said softly, as they sat by the window. I think she bore more than people knew. After her father's death, there was pressure from every side. Her cousin George, the solicitor Mr. Trent, even poor Peter, who admired her more than was wise. Admired her? Miss Marple asked gently, her needles clicking as she worked at a length of soft gray wool. Mrs. Harcourt smiled faintly. Oh yes, dear. Peter was devoted to her, though I doubt she thought of him in that way. She was lonely, perhaps, but not foolish. Still, she might have told him things she would not tell others. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. She had suspected as much. It explained Peter's nervous presence in the rectory, not as a culprit, but perhaps as a witness, unwilling to confess what he had overheard. Before she left, Mrs. Harcourt grew solemn. There is something else, Miss Marple. Clara once hinted to me that her father had left papers. Something hidden. She said it might change everything, if only she could find them. And then she laughed it off, as though she had said too much. But I remember the look in her eyes. Miss Marple thanked her and walked slowly back through the village. The diary's unfinished words now seemed clearer. I must tell the truth at last. Was it the truth about the colonel's will? About debts? Or secret papers? Or something more personal? A truth of the heart, hidden among village gossip? At the rectory gates she paused, watching Sergeant Webb emerge with Mr. Trent. They spoke in low voices, but she caught one phrase as the wind carried it toward her. If those papers were found, half the village would be in uproar. Miss Marple's eyes brightened, though her expression remained serene. Secrets of money and inheritance. They had caused bloodshed many times before. And now, she thought, they might very well explain the last entry in a young woman's diary. Chapter 6. A Talk with Peter. The next morning dawned bright, with a coolness in the air that hinted at autumn. Miss Marple, rising earlier than usual, decided it was time to speak directly to young Peter Ellison. She found him not at the vicarage, but sitting alone by the riverbank, a fishing rod limp at his side, though he clearly had no intention of catching anything. He started when he saw her, color rushing to his cheeks. Oh, Miss Marple. I didn't hear you coming. My dear boy, she said gently, settling herself on the grassy bank beside him. I don't suppose you did. You were deep in thought. Peter looked down at the water. They think I killed her. Miss Marple's knitting bag rested in her lap. She did not open it, but her fingers tapped softly against the fabric. Some people think so, yes. It is often convenient to point a finger quickly, especially at the young. But you and I know better, don't we? Peter's eyes filled with sudden tears, which he blinked away fiercely. I didn't hurt Clara. I cared for her more than anyone. She was kind to me when no one else was. I only wanted to help. Help her with what, dear? Miss Marple's voice was as soft as the breeze that stirred the reeds. Peter hesitated. His hands twisted on the handle of the fishing rod. She told me she'd found something. Papers of her father's. She said it was dangerous, that people would be angry if they knew. I begged her not to go on with it, but she said she had to write it down in her diary so there would be proof. And did she tell you what these papers were? He shook his head miserably. Only that they had to do with money. And with someone in the village. She wouldn't say who. Miss Marple regarded him closely. Is that why you were at the rectory the night she died? Yes, he whispered. I went to try and stop her. I thought if she destroyed the diary, no one would know. I was afraid for her. But when I got there, he broke off, shivering. She was already at the desk. I heard her cry out, and when I ran in, she was gone. The boy's shoulders shook. Miss Marple laid a comforting hand on his arm. You must be brave, Peter, she said kindly. What you saw may be more important than you think. Do not hide it from the police. Half-truths only make you look guilty. He looked at her with wide, troubled eyes. But if I tell them, they'll still say it was me. Miss Marple's gaze softened. Leave that to me, dear boy. I have known many young men in villages over the years. Follies and foolishness, yes. Murder, rarely. As she rose and walked back toward the village, her thoughts were steady. Peter had confirmed what she already suspected. Clara's death was tied not to passion alone, but to something written, hidden, and dangerous. And somewhere in Rosehill, someone had been desperate enough to keep those papers buried, even if it meant silencing a young woman forever. Chapter 7. The Cousin's Claim. Clara Goddard's cousin, George Goddard, arrived in Rosehill the day after the tragedy. His presence caused a stir, for George had not been seen in the village since the colonel's funeral. A tall, heavy-set man with a ruddy complexion and sharp gray eyes, he strode into the solicitor's office as though he already owned half the parish. By evening, everyone knew he had gone straight to Mr. Trent to discuss the colonel's estate. Whispers spread quickly. George believed that Clara's death changed the matter entirely, and that certain properties might now fall to him. Miss Marple, passing through the high street, observed George from a distance as he emerged from the office. His step was brisk, his expression one of satisfaction thinly veiled behind solemnity. She had seen such faces before, men who dressed grief in black coats while already counting their gain. At supper that night, Mrs. Bell held forth with relish. It's clear as daylight. Clara meant to write about those very papers in her diary. She found something in the colonel's will that George wanted hidden. And now, well, now she's gone. Mr. Pritchard snorted into his ale. Dangerous to talk like that, Mrs. Bell. The police won't thank you for it. But the villagers listened eagerly, for the tale fitted neatly with their own suspicions. Clara had papers. Clara had been silenced. And George Goddard, with his sudden return and sharp dealings, seemed just the sort of man to profit from her absence. Miss Marple, meanwhile, sat in her cottage with her lamp lit low, knitting in her lap. She thought over what Peter had told her, and what Mrs. Harcourt had hinted. Clara had indeed discovered something her father left behind. George Goddard might well have reason to prevent such papers from surfacing. Yet Miss Marple's experience told her that human motives were rarely so simple. Greed explained much, but not always the precise shape of an action. Clara's diary had ended mid-sentence, her pen dragged across the page. That suggested not a premeditated poisoning alone, but the intrusion of someone at the very moment she was writing. She set down her needles. George Goddard might indeed have reason to wish Clara gone. But had he been at the rectory that night? The answer to that question, Miss Marple knew, would not be found in whispered speculation, but in the small, ordinary details that others overlooked. And she, more than anyone, knew how to notice them. Chapter 8. Secrets in the Solicitor's Office. The following morning, Miss Marple made a quiet errand to Mr. Trent's office. She had no official business there, at least none he would recognize, but long experience had taught her that a friendly visit, under the guise of a simple question, often revealed more than any formal interrogation. The solicitor's office stood on the corner of the high street, its windows shaded by green curtains, its interior smelling faintly of ink and leather. Mr. Trent rose from behind his desk as she entered, his manner courteous, though there was a flicker of unease in his eyes. Miss Marple. What a pleasant surprise. What can I do for you? Oh, nothing of importance, Mr. Trent, she said mildly, settling herself in a chair. I was merely inquiring after a receipt for the church bazaar, and I thought you might know whether it was ever properly signed. He fussed with a pile of papers, searching pointlessly for the imaginary receipt. Miss Marple's gaze, meanwhile, drifted across the desk. There, half hidden beneath a blotter, was a folder marked in bold ink, Goddard Estate. Her eyes returned politely to Mr. Trent's face. I was very shocked about poor Clara. Such a pretty girl and so full of promise. I understand she had been in some discussion with you about her late father's affairs. Mr. Trent cleared his throat. Yes, purely routine, of course. Matters of probate, small accounts. Nothing to trouble her with. I did advise her, however, not to burden herself with legal complexities. They are rarely suited to young ladies. Indeed, said Miss Marple gently. And yet, I believe she was writing something important in her diary when she died. Something she considered the truth. Would it, perhaps, have touched upon legal matters? For the briefest moment, Mr. Trent's hand froze upon the blotter. Then he smiled thinly. Speculation, Miss Marple. We mustn't indulge in it. The police are doing their work. Clara's death is a great tragedy, but I trust it will soon be laid to rest. Miss Marple inclined her head, murmured her thanks, and allowed herself to be shown out. But her mind was alert. She had caught that instant of hesitation, the nervous tightening of the mouth. Mr. Trent knew far more than he wished to admit. As she walked back down the high street, she passed George Goddard loitering near the inn, speaking in low tones to a stranger she did not recognize. The man was well dressed, with a narrow face and restless eyes. Miss Marple did not pause, but she observed the detail keenly. Outsiders seldom came to Rosehill without cause. Back at her cottage, she sat by the fire, her knitting forgotten in her lap. Two things were now certain. Clara had discovered something in her father's papers that endangered others, and both her cousin and the solicitor had reasons to keep it hidden. But which of them, or perhaps another entirely, had been desperate enough to silence her hand as she wrote? Miss Marple's pale eyes brightened. Somewhere in the quiet fabric of village life lay the missing thread, and once she tugged at it, the whole pattern would unravel. Chapter 9. An Unexpected Visitor. The village was still buzzing with speculation when Rosehill received a visitor who quickly became the subject of fresh gossip. Mrs. Lydia Arkwright, a woman of striking presence, tall and immaculately dressed, with a hat that seemed far too grand for village lanes. She arrived at the inn in a motor car that drew half the children of Rosehill to gape at its shining wheels. By evening, it was known in every cottage that she had once been very close to Colonel Goddard. Close enough, some said, to have been whispered about during his lifetime. Miss Marple, seated at her window with her knitting, watched the motor car from a distance. She did not need the chatter of Mrs. Bell to tell her that Mrs. Arkwright's sudden appearance was no coincidence. The timing, so soon after Clara's death, was altogether too neat. The following morning, Miss Marple saw Mrs. Arkwright again, this time stepping into Mr. Trent's office. The sight confirmed what she had already begun to suspect. The Colonel's estate was not merely a matter of family inheritance, but entangled with relationships that had been carefully concealed. Later that day, by chance, or so it seemed, Miss Marple encountered Mrs. Arkwright in the churchyard. The woman, though gracious, carried herself with the air of one constantly measuring her words. So tragic about poor Clara, Mrs. Arkwright said, lowering her veil. A sensitive girl, I fear. These small villages can be oppressive for those of a finer nature. Indeed, Miss Marple replied mildly, her eyes fixed on the ivy creeping up the church wall. Yet she was about to reveal something very important, I believe. One wonders what it could have been. Mrs. Arkwright's gloved hand tightened briefly on her purse. Oh, diaries are such sentimental things. Best not to read too much into them. Miss Marple nodded, offering no challenge, but she did not miss the quick flush that rose beneath the woman's veil. It was the reaction of someone with something to hide. That evening, as Miss Marple sat alone in her cottage, she pieced together the pattern. Clara had papers. Papers her father had left behind. Mr. Trent knew of them. George Goddard had a claim upon them. And now Mrs. Arkwright appeared, uninvited yet strangely insistent, as though to protect some secret of her own. The last entry in Clara's diary was becoming clearer in Miss Marple's mind. I must tell the truth at last. Tonight. It was no mere personal confession. It was the key to an inheritance, a scandal, and perhaps a ruinous revelation that touched more than one villager. And someone, determined that the truth should never be told, had silenced Clara before she could finish the sentence. Miss Marple folded her knitting with calm precision. The circle of suspects was widening, but her intuition told her the net was also drawing closer. Chapter 10. The Letter in the Drawer. The vicarage at Rosehill was not often the scene of drama, but on a damp Thursday morning Mrs. Price, the vicar's wife, bustled into Miss Marple's sitting room with eyes alight. My dear Miss Marple, you won't believe what has come to light. The Colonel's old writing desk has been sent from the Goddard house to the solicitor, and while it was being moved, a drawer stuck. They forced it open and found a letter, an unposted letter, addressed to Mrs. Lydia Arkwright. Miss Marple set down her teacup carefully. Indeed. That is most interesting. Oh, more than interesting, Mrs. Price whispered. The letter spoke of money. Large sums, apparently. And it hinted at something Clara did not know. Some arrangement between her father and Mrs. Arkwright. Miss Marple did not ask how Mrs. Price had come by the details. In a village such as Rosehill, information flowed in curious channels, and she suspected Mr. Trent's clerk had a looser tongue than his employer would like. That afternoon, Miss Marple walked to the churchyard, where she often found her thoughts came clearer. The stillness of the place, the stones leaning with age, seemed to sharpen her mind rather than dull it. Clara had been about to reveal the truth. A diary entry cut short. And now this letter emerged. Proof that her father had a financial entanglement with Mrs. Arkwright. Had Clara discovered it? Was that what she intended to expose? Later, Miss Marple paid a visit to the Goddard house. She found George in the library, looking weary but oddly defensive. The letter, he admitted with a forced laugh, was nothing but a personal matter. Ah, Miss Marple murmured, smoothing her gloves. But it was hidden in a drawer. Hidden things, in my experience, are rarely innocent. George's face tightened. You mustn't take village gossip too seriously, Miss Marple. My cousin Clara, she was fragile, prone to fancies. It may be she imagined dangers where none existed. Miss Marple only smiled, the kind of smile that revealed nothing but observed everything. She thanked him politely and left, though her thoughts were racing. Fragile. Clara had been many things, but Miss Marple doubted fragility had been her greatest trait. Courage, yes. Determination, perhaps too much of it. Enough to place her in someone's way. That evening, Miss Marple sat at her window, the firelight flickering over her knitting needles. Her mind was piecing together a pattern. Clara's diary, the Colonel's hidden letter, Mrs. Arkwright's sudden return, and George's evasions. Somewhere in those tangled threads lay the motive for murder. And Miss Marple was very good at unraveling tangled threads. Chapter 11. Whispers at the Inn. The Rosehill Inn, usually a quiet refuge for weary travelers, had become a hub of gossip since Clara's death. The villagers gathered in the evenings over tankards of ale, their voices lowered yet urgent, each eager to contribute a theory. Miss Marple, sitting quietly by the fire with her knitting, was a familiar sight and rarely questioned. To most, she was merely the kindly spinster who liked to listen while her needles clicked away. Few realized that she was listening with more than idle curiosity. On this particular evening, two men at the bar drew her attention. Mr. Hawkins, the innkeeper, and a stranger staying in one of the upper rooms. He was the same narrow-faced man Miss Marple had seen speaking with George Goddard earlier in the week. "I tell you," Hawkins muttered, "there's more to it. The Colonel had dealings. Money dealings that folk don't know about. I've seen gentlemen like him ruined before." The stranger leaned in, voice low but not quite low enough. "Ruined, you say? Or blackmailed?" Miss Marple's needles paused mid-click. She bent her head again, but her ears caught every syllable. The conversation turned abruptly when another villager entered, but Miss Marple's mind was already working. Blackmail. It explained so much. The hidden letter, Mrs. Arkwright's sudden reappearance, Clara's determination to confess something in her diary. Later, as the inn grew quiet, Miss Marple noticed the stranger slip out into the night. She followed at a discreet distance, her steps careful on the cobbled street. The man walked directly to Mr. Trent's office, rapped twice on the door, and was admitted at once. Miss Marple stood in the shadows, her breath a soft cloud in the chill air. So, the solicitor and the stranger were allies of some kind. That was worth remembering. Back at her cottage, she sat before the fire, the needles lying untouched in her lap. Gossip at the inn had confirmed what she already suspected. Clara's death was not simply a crime of passion or despair. It was tied to money, secrets, and the dangerous power of knowledge. And Miss Marple, with her quiet persistence, was closer than ever to knowing why Clara had to die. Chapter 12. A Fragment of Paper. The next morning dawned gray and misty, the kind of weather that muffled sound and blurred the outlines of the cottages. Miss Marple welcomed it, for she always thought a village looked most revealing when it believed itself hidden. She had reason for her early walk, a discreet visit to the church vestry, where Mrs. Price had told her some of Clara's things were temporarily stored. With the vicar's quiet permission, Miss Marple was allowed to look over a box of books and papers that had belonged to the girl. Among hymnals and school exercise books lay Clara's diary, or rather what remained of it. The last pages were torn, as if someone had ripped them hastily. Miss Marple's thin fingers brushed across the rough edge of the paper. Whoever had silenced Clara had also tried to destroy her words. But tucked between two other books was a small fragment, a corner of a page that had escaped the tearing. On it was a single phrase, written in Clara's neat hand. "And if he refuses, I shall have to tell the truth." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. If he refuses? Who was he? Colonel Goddard already dead? George? Or perhaps Mr. Trent? The line hinted at a confrontation, one Clara had intended to bring into the open. Miss Marple slipped the scrap of paper into her handbag and returned the box precisely as she had found it. Details mattered. One must never let others know one had been searching. That afternoon she paid a call on Mrs. Arkwright at the inn. The woman received her graciously enough, but her manner was strained, her eyes darting often to the window as though expecting someone. "I wonder," Miss Marple said gently, "if Clara ever confided in you about her father's affairs?" Confided? Mrs. Arkwright's laugh was brittle. "The girl disliked me intensely. She made it very clear she considered me an intruder. I had no influence over her." Said Miss Marple, her gaze mild. Yet she seemed determined to write something down. Something about a truth to be told, unless a certain gentleman agreed to something. Mrs. Arkwright stiffened, her gloved hand tightening on the arm of her chair. "You have a lively imagination, Miss Marple. I fear you let village gossip color your judgment." Miss Marple smiled, unoffended. But as she took her leave, she noted the pallor under the woman's rouge, the nervous tightening of her lips. Mrs. Arkwright knew far more than she dared admit. That evening, as dusk settled over Rosehill, Miss Marple sat by her fire and considered the fragment again. Clara had confronted someone. A man, almost certainly. She had demanded something, and if he refused, she would expose the truth. It was a threat. And threats, Miss Marple knew well, could be deadly. Chapter 13. The Locked Drawer. Inspector Graves was not a man easily impressed, but even he admitted to Miss Marple one afternoon in the High Street that the case had grown sticky. "We've a tangle here," he muttered, tugging at his mustache. "Letters, money, and now this business of Clara's diary. Everyone says something different, and half of them are lying. I can feel it." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically, as though she had no opinions of her own. So difficult, isn't it? People do so dislike speaking the truth when it may cause unpleasantness. I have always found that even the smallest fib, when told for convenience, can lead to terrible consequences. The inspector gave her a wary look, as though suspecting more beneath her gentle words, and departed. That same evening Miss Marple received a visitor, Mrs. Price, flustered and whispering, "My dear, I hardly know what to make of it, but the innkeeper's boy swears he saw George Goddard tampering with Mr. Trent's office after dark. A locked drawer, he said. It was forced open." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. A locked drawer. Such things always concealed trouble. The next morning she strolled past the solicitor's office and observed the window half open, a careless oversight for such a meticulous man. Through the gap in the curtains she caught sight of Trent himself, bent low over his desk, his face pale, his hands trembling slightly as he shuffled a sheaf of papers. That evening at the inn, the stranger with the narrow face was seen again, this time speaking urgently with Trent. Miss Marple, seated unobtrusively nearby, caught only a fragment of their words. She found it too dangerous. "We can't let it surface." The rest was lost in the clatter of crockery, but it was enough. Clara had found something, a document most likely from that locked drawer. And whatever it was, both the solicitor and the stranger feared it might yet come to light. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple's knitting lay untouched on her lap. Her thoughts were clear now. Clara had stumbled upon evidence that threatened reputations and fortunes. She had prepared to expose it, writing her last diary entry as she steeled herself for confrontation. But before she could finish the words, death had silenced her hand. Miss Marple's gaze lifted to the quiet village street beyond her window. To outward eyes, Rosehill was unchanged, the same gossipy, tidy little community. Yet beneath its calm surface, currents of greed and desperation swirled. And Miss Marple was very near to discovering where those currents led. Chapter 14. The Shadow of Blackmail. The rain had set in heavily that week, drumming against cottage roofs and making the lanes of Rosehill glisten with mud. To most villagers, it was an inconvenience. To Miss Marple, it was a blessing, for rainy days loosen tongues. People lingered indoors, talking longer than they ought. That was how she came to hear, from Mrs. Bell at the post office, that a letter had arrived some weeks before addressed not to Clara, but to her late father, long after his death. It bore no return address, only the initials L.A. "Mrs. Arkwright," Miss Marple murmured as though idly repeating a name. Mrs. Bell leaned closer. "You've the right of it. She's at the heart of it, mark my words." That letter came, and not 2 days later Clara was seen upset in the lane, white as her pinafore. Miss Marple thanked her and went on her way, but her mind was sharp. A letter with initials, Clara's distress, a diary entry about truth and refusal. The puzzle was taking shape. That afternoon, she visited the inn again under pretext of taking tea. Mrs. Arkwright was in the parlor, her manner gracious but strained. Miss Marple let the conversation drift from weather to memory, then to Clara. "Poor child," Mrs. Arkwright said with a sigh. "So impressionable. She might have misread her father's affairs entirely. Men of business often keep matters private, and the young do not always understand." "Very true," Miss Marple agreed softly. "But I think Clara understood rather more than anyone expected. She had, I believe, seen something in writing." For a heartbeat, Mrs. Arkwright's polished composure cracked. Her eyes flashed with alarm before she forced a smile. "Nonsense, dear lady. I was hardly in Rosehill in those days. I cannot imagine what you mean." Miss Marple merely sipped her tea as mild as milk and said nothing further. But she had seen enough. Mrs. Arkwright was not merely involved. She was afraid. That evening, word spread of another disturbance. The narrow-faced stranger had left the inn suddenly, without paying his bill. Some said he had taken a train at dawn, others that he was still lurking near the woods. To Miss Marple it mattered little. His part had been played. He was a go-between, a carrier of secrets, but not the mastermind. The real players were here in Rosehill. The solicitor, the cousin, and the woman with the initials L.A. And Miss Marple was beginning to see how Clara's final diary entry threatened them all. Chapter 15. The Midnight Conversation. It was close to midnight when Miss Marple, unable to sleep, sat by her window and noticed movement outside. The lane was dark, but her sharp eyes caught two figures meeting near the church gate. One was George Goddard. The other, unmistakably, was Mr. Trent. The men spoke in hushed, urgent tones. Though their words did not carry clearly, their gestures did. George's arm slashed through the air in frustration. Trent's head bent low, hands spread in a placating manner. Twice Miss Marple thought she heard the word letter. At last the two parted, George striding off in anger, Trent retreating toward his office. The quiet lane was empty once more. Miss Marple drew her curtains and sat back in her chair, her mind working carefully. The solicitor and the heir apparent were no allies. They were conspirators forced together by necessity. And that necessity, she suspected, was the threat Clara had posed in her final diary entry. The following morning, she attended the market and allowed herself to linger near the stalls, where gossip was freshest. From Mrs. Bell she learned that George had withdrawn a considerable sum from his bank account only days before Clara's death. From Mrs. Price she heard that Mr. Trent had been seen burning papers late at night in his office grate. Miss Marple smiled her mild, almost apologetic smile. Villagers seldom realized how much they gave away with their chatter. By afternoon she had resolved upon a quiet test of her own. She wrote a small anonymous note, just a few words on plain paper, and arranged for it to be slipped under Mr. Trent's office door. The truth of Clara's diary is known. If you wish to prevent its disclosure, meet me at the churchyard tomorrow after dusk. Miss Marple had no intention of revealing herself at that meeting. Instead, she planned to observe from the shadows. A guilty conscience, she had found, often betrays itself when given the slightest nudge. That night, as she set her knitting neatly aside, her thoughts returned to Clara. The poor girl had stood alone, armed with nothing but her diary and her courage. She had confronted deceit where she found it and paid for her bravery with her life. Miss Marple's expression grew solemn. The least she could do was finish what Clara had begun, to bring the truth at last into the light. Chapter 16. The Churchyard Trap. The churchyard at dusk was a place of quiet solemnity, the headstones casting long shadows across the damp grass. Miss Marple arrived early and concealed herself behind a yew tree whose branches hung low and dark. From there, she had a clear view of the central path without risk of being seen. The note she had arranged to be delivered was simple, but she knew enough of human weakness to be certain that someone would come. The guilty, after all, are rarely able to resist the chance to protect themselves. The first to arrive was Mr. Trent. He came briskly, glancing over his shoulder, his hat pulled low. He carried a small case in his hand, which he opened briefly to check its contents before snapping it shut again. A few minutes later, George Goddard appeared from the opposite direction. His face was pale in the dim light, his jaw tight with anger. The two men confronted one another beneath the shadow of the church tower. Miss Marple strained her ears but could only catch fragments. "You swore it was destroyed," George hissed. "There's nothing left to find. Unless she made a copy," Trent muttered back. George's fist clenched. "You'd better be right. If anyone learns—" He stopped abruptly, his eyes darting around the darkened yard. "Did you hear something?" Miss Marple held her breath, perfectly still. Trent shook his head impatiently. Nerves. Goddard. Nothing more. The conversation ended abruptly when footsteps echoed along the path, the vicar making his late rounds. Startled, the two men parted at once, George striding toward the gate, Trent disappearing into the lane. When the churchyard was empty once more, Miss Marple stepped quietly from her hiding place. She had heard enough to confirm her suspicion. Clara had discovered something about her father's estate, something so dangerous that both George and the solicitor were desperate to keep it hidden. And desperate men, Miss Marple knew, were capable of anything. As she walked home through the damp night air, her mind turned over the evidence. Clara had confronted someone. She had written in her diary that she must tell the truth. The last line cut short by death. Miss Marple's lips pressed together. The truth was within reach now. But she must tread carefully, for those who had silenced Clara would not hesitate to strike again if they felt cornered. Chapter 17. A Confession Over Tea. The next morning dawned with an unusual brightness. The rain clouds swept away, leaving Rosehill fresh and glistening. Miss Marple, however, felt no cheer in the weather. She had much to think about after her observations in the churchyard. She decided to pay a visit to Mrs. Price, knowing that the vicar's wife had a way of hearing things before anyone else. A casual call for tea in Mrs. Price's kitchen often yielded more than a police interrogation. The kettle had barely begun to sing when Mrs. Price leaned forward, eyes gleaming with the thrill of knowledge. "My dear Miss Marple, there's talk that George Goddard has been pressing Mr. Trent for money. Some old debt of his father's, they say. And Clara. Well, Clara found out. That's why she was so troubled." Miss Marple stirred her tea gently. "A debt, you think?" Mrs. Price nodded. "Oh yes. More than one, if rumor is true. Colonel Goddard may have appeared prosperous, but he left behind a tangle. And George, poor young man, is not free of difficulties either. Clara knew something, I am sure, and that solicitor, sly as a fox, has been trying to keep it quiet." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her expression thoughtful. "It is extraordinary, is it not, how debts can weigh heavier than chains? I have seen young men do desperate things when cornered. Desperate and often foolish." Mrs. Price, thrilled to be part of such seriousness, leaned closer. "Do you think George might truly be guilty?" Miss Marple's smile was gentle. "Guilt comes in many forms, Mrs. Price. Sometimes it lies not in what one has done, but in what one allows another to do. Time will tell." That afternoon, Miss Marple returned to her cottage, but her mind remained busy. Clara's death was not the act of a stranger. It was bound tightly to the village itself, to debts, to hidden letters, to secrets in drawers. But there was more. Miss Marple felt it keenly. A hand behind the scenes, directing the smaller moves. Someone clever enough to let others quarrel, while hiding their own culpability. Her knitting clicked softly in the quiet room. "Yes," she murmured to herself, "there is still one piece missing. But it will come." Chapter 18. The Missing Copy. 2 days passed quietly in Rosehill, though beneath the surface the air was thick with tension. Miss Marple sensed it in the way people lowered their voices in the street, in the sudden silences when she entered a shop. Everyone was waiting for something, though none could say what. Her answer came unexpectedly from young Tommy Bell, the postmistress's nephew, who appeared at her garden gate with a crumpled envelope in hand. "Found this, Miss Marple," he said eagerly. "Down by the brook. Thought it looked important. Auntie says I shouldn't meddle, but—" Miss Marple thanked him kindly, rewarded him with a peppermint, and examined the find once he had scampered away. The envelope was damp, the ink blurred by water, but still legible. It was addressed in Clara's handwriting, though never posted. The addressee, Mrs. Lydia Arkwright. Inside was a single page, smudged but clear enough. "You may have deceived my father, but you shall not deceive me. I have the papers, and I have made a copy. If you refuse to do what is right, I shall place it in safe hands." Miss Marple's lips pressed into a thin line. This was the missing link. Clara had discovered something damning, a truth powerful enough to ruin reputations. She had not merely threatened, she had taken precautions. A copy of the evidence existed somewhere. That afternoon, Miss Marple walked into the churchyard, her mind alert. She remembered the heated words between George and Mr. Trent, their fear of a copy. They had believed Clara's discovery destroyed. They were wrong. As she lingered near the graves, she noticed Mrs. Arkwright herself entering, her face pale beneath her fine hat. The woman moved swiftly to a corner of the yard, as though searching among the stones. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. Was this where Clara had hidden her copy? The older woman waited until she was alone, then bent quickly, lifting a loose slab of stone. She drew out a small packet, glanced around nervously, and tucked it into her handbag. Miss Marple did not move, though her heart quickened. The truth was nearly in her grasp. But she must be patient. It would not do to confront Mrs. Arkwright now, when the woman's nerves were already stretched thin. Instead, Miss Marple returned home, her mind working quietly. Clara's voice seemed to echo from the torn diary. I must tell the truth at last. Tonight. The truth was hidden still, but not for much longer. Chapter 19. Shadows at Dusk. Evening settled over Rosehill with a heavy stillness. The sky glowed faintly gold before surrendering to violet dusk, and lamps flickered to life one by one along the narrow lanes. Miss Marple, sitting by her window with her knitting, watched the shadows lengthen. Her thoughts were not on her needles but on Mrs. Arkwright and the mysterious packet she had retrieved from the churchyard. She was not the only one alert that evening. Across the village, unseen eyes followed movements, waiting for opportunities. Clara's secret had become a dangerous prize, and now, with the threat of exposure, desperation was sure to follow. At 8:30, a commotion broke out in the high street. A child, frightened, came running to the constable with a tale of voices raised in anger near the vicarage garden. By the time Sergeant Harker arrived, the place was empty, save for a glove lying in the grass. A fine leather glove. A woman's. News of the incident spread quickly. Some swore they had seen George Goddard storming away from the lane. Others whispered that Mr. Trent had been seen skulking near the hedges. But no one could say with certainty. Miss Marple, when she heard, felt a cold certainty of her own. The confrontation was about Clara's copy. Someone had tried to wrest it from Mrs. Arkwright, and nearly succeeded. The next morning, her suspicions were confirmed in part when Mrs. Arkwright herself appeared at Miss Marple's cottage, pale and shaken. My dear Miss Marple, she began, her voice trembling. I hardly know where to turn. Someone followed me last night. Tried to take something I was carrying. She hesitated, then pressed her lips together. I cannot say more, but you must believe me. I am in danger. Miss Marple regarded her kindly. Danger often comes not from strangers, Mrs. Arkwright, but from those very near to us. May I advise you, keep nothing secret now. It is truth alone that can save you. But Mrs. Arkwright only shook her head, tears in her eyes. You don't understand. If the truth comes out, it will ruin us all. When she had gone, Miss Marple sat back, thoughtful. The woman was terrified, not merely of exposure, but of someone's determination to silence her. And in that silence, Miss Marple saw clearly the shadow of the killer. The net was tightening. Soon, the final knot would be drawn. Chapter 20. The Broken Alibi. The following day brought a tense hush to Rosehill. People spoke in lowered voices, as though fearing their words might carry too far. Clara's death, once only a mystery, now hung over the village like a storm cloud ready to break. Miss Marple spent the morning in quiet visits. A word here, a question there, always gently asked, always wrapped in her kindly smile. By noon she had gathered what she needed. The pattern was becoming clear. It was a small remark from Mrs. Price that gave the final tug at the threads. Funny thing, she said, polishing her teacups. Mr. Trent swore he was at his office that evening, but I passed by and saw the lights dark. Not a soul inside. And when I asked his clerk later, he said Mr. Trent had left early. Very strange, don't you think? Very strange indeed. Trent's alibi, neat and precise, was beginning to crumble. That afternoon Miss Marple sought out Sergeant Harker. The policeman, though respectful, was weary of theories that contradicted his own. Yet when Miss Marple quietly suggested that Mr. Trent's movements be looked into, his frown deepened. Are you saying Trent's lied outright? He demanded. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly. I am saying only this. Clara Trent discovered something dangerous, and those nearest to her had the most to lose. Falsehoods, Sergeant, are rather like loose stitches. They always unravel sooner or later. By evening, word spread that Mr. Trent had been questioned again, and this time his answers faltered. He had not been at his office the whole night. He had, in fact, left to take a walk, a vague excuse no one believed. In the Rosehill in that night, gossip roared like a fire. Some declared it proof of his guilt. Others whispered of George Goddard's temper, or Lydia Arkwright's secrets. Yet all agreed on one thing. Miss Marple's calm certainty had shaken the case more than any policeman's search. Alone in her cottage, Miss Marple laid aside her knitting and gazed into the fire. The time for listening was nearly over. The time for revelation was at hand. Clara's last entry, the hidden copy, the broken alibi, all pointed to one truth. Soon she would draw the net tight.